Guys, I just watched Helluva Boss Season 2, Episode 6, and holy shit, it was so good. It was so goddamn good. I'm so happy that I didn't spoil myself with the leaked, unfinished version, because this is no question my favorite episode of Season 2. The visuals, plot, and character work, my god, the character work, was nothing short of amazing. It makes all the other episodes of Season 2 look shameful, and I honestly have no idea what happened behind the scenes that made this episode stand out. In this video, I'm going to do a brief summary of the episode and then go over all of the aspects of the show I absolutely loved, with some minor nitpicks sprinkled in between. Obviously, there's a spoiler warning, and if you haven't seen the episode, stop the video and go watch it right now. I don't care about views, just go watch the episode. It's so good. But without further ado, let's dive in. So the episode kicks off in the Lust Ring at Asmodeus' palace, where the previous hints at Fizzarolli and Ozzie's secret romance is fully drawn out, and we get to see how they act behind closed doors. Just all over each other and supportive and caring, a stark contrast to how they acted in Season 1, Episode 7. Against Ozzie's better judgment, Fizzarolli decides to go down to the Greed Ring alone for his rehearsal with Mammon, where he runs into Blitz. They get into a fight after throwing nasty back and forth comments about each other, and soon after they both get kidnapped by Stryker. Meanwhile, Stolas goes to visit Asmodeus, asking for an Asmodean crystal, which would allow Blitz to travel to Earth without the need to see Stolas at all. But their meeting gets cut short from a call by none other than Crimson himself. So it turns out Crimson and Stryker are working together, and their plan is to hold Fizzarolli for ransom and force Asmodeus to sign over his resources to Crimson in order to get Fizzarolli back safely. And I guess Blitz is just there because both Crimson and Stryker have a personal hatred towards him. Well, it doesn't take long for Blitz and Fizzarolli to eventually break out of their cell and fight their way to escaping Crimson's warehouse. As they progress, they reflect on their tragic past of how Blitz was always jealous of Fizz, being praised over him by everyone. This culminates in Blitz burning down the entire All-In circus and not only causing Fizzarolli permanent scars and lost limbs, but also the loss of Blitz's mother, which leads to a chain reaction of Barbie going to rehab and developing an undying hatred for Blitz. Blitz could have saved Fizzarolli, but he didn't. He decides to just run away and forget about all of it, leaving Fizz to die. But Blitz reveals that the fire was actually an accident and that he did want to save everyone, but he couldn't because he was just so overwhelmed and frightened. As Blitz and Fizzarolli let out all their feelings about each other, they start to become closer and closer, as they were during their childhood. After more fighting, some jokes, and a song from Fizzarolli, they finally escape the warehouse. And after a series of events, the entire place catches on fire, with Fizzarolli caught in the middle of it, an exact recreation of what happened all those years ago. But this time, after finally coming to terms with his past, Blitz decides to save Fizzarolli. Fizz gets back home safely, Stolas gets the Asmodean crystal, and the episode ends. And that's it, that's the plot for Helluva Boss Season 2, Episode 6. To start off, let's talk about the visual aspect of the episode. This is the best looking episode in the entire season, might arguably be the best in the entire show. It's so clean and vibrant, and the characters feel so much more expressive than they did in most episodes. The beginning of Fizz's song was honestly kind of jarring with how many different things were on the screen, but the creativity was just mind-blowing how much stuff was shoved into that, and I honestly loved it. I also love the way they blended magic with technology so seamlessly, and it's such an original concept that you don't really see anywhere. And I just have to point out, the way Stryker's evil menacing expression immediately disappears when Crimson says cut is probably the funniest thing to me in this episode. I was on the floor laughing when I saw this. And my god, Fizz's tragic backstory hits hard. The way the scene feels so fast-paced actually works for me because it makes it feel more like a flashback, how we as the audience are seeing a memory through their eyes. The explosions also look especially good, and Fizz slowly reaching out his arm as it burns away with Blitz's silhouette in his eyes. This is just absolutely stellar. It's cinematic, and the way everything about the flashback parallels to the fire in Lululand is just genius writing. Like, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a bunch of other cool little details I noticed, and I'm sure there's a dozen more, which I'll probably just cover in a YouTube short later, but here's some of the main ones that I liked. Out of all his pets, Fizzarolli especially finds appreciation in this particular one because it has a physical disability just like he does. And that leads me into another thing I never knew about imps the entire time I watched Helluva Boss until just now: scarring tissue. I never knew that scarring tissue was always white. I thought imps were just naturally a mix of red and white, but now it actually makes sense because the right half of Blitz's face is white because that's where the explosion hit him. And as for Fizzarolli, his face is entirely white except for that one red spot from wearing the clown nose. And I think that this dog being pale, unlike the others, is a direct reference to that. There's a lot to unpack from the newspaper as well, but I'll just save that for a short later. And of course, all the fight choreography is absolutely amazing. Helluva Boss does not fuck around when it comes to making these fight scenes. They're all so good. I like how Fizzarolli initially has no idea how to fight in combat because he's just been living in this protective bubble with Asmodeus, but then he also learns to utilize his unique abilities over time. One of the many problems I had with Truth Seekers is that the writers just decided to turn Luna into this absolute milli-level badass fighter out of thin air just because it looked cool, and it made no sense because the whole point of her not going on any of Imp's missions was because she was described as a vulnerable goth girl. And if she was always staying at Imp, then where did she even learn to be just as good of a kick-ass fighter as the rest of Imp? I just thought the whole thing, although good for spectacle, was just contrived and dumb when you really thought about it. But here in this episode, I really appreciate how they actually took the time to have a character who clearly doesn't know how to fight and make them slowly get better and better at it over time, rather than just say, oh, he was always this top tier badass fighting machine, even though it would make no logical sense for him to be one. As for the audio, it's mostly great. Sometimes the background music doesn't really fit perfectly during conversations, but it's not distracting, and there's no parts where track is entirely misplaced, like What You're Thinking About, or that really questionable Disney song when Stolas is with Blitz in his room. Of course, the flashback music is all perfect. The way it surges when Blitz says, I did care, damn, they got me teary-eyed for a second. Okay, now I'm really blurring the line between visual auditory aspects of the episode and the plot. So now it's actually time to dive into that as well as the character writing. And this is where we get to the real meat of the video, why I see this episode as a true Helluva Boss masterpiece. Now it's no surprise that my favorite part of the episode is Blitz and Fizzarolli. Everything about their dialogue, to their facial expressions, to their backstory is just perfect. Like, they play off of each other's characters so well. Before watching the episode, I had no idea how Fizz losing his arms and legs would be incorporated into the story, and a part of me thought that it would just turn out like Barbie Wire, where they leave it ambiguous and don't even explain it at all. But the flashbacks in this episode did not hold back whatsoever. It went all out with the drama and the emotion and tragedy, and oh my god, I love it so much. I legitimately think there is no better way to write this backstory. And a large portion of this video is dedicated to just that. I'm going to do a deep dive into the flashbacks and why their backstory works so well for me, how it lines up with the characters of Blitz and Fizzarolli, and how it ties into the actual plot of the episode. Because it's just all perfect from start to finish. I feel like I'm geeking out about this. It's just so good. This show really loves to play around with the idea of Blitz's unspoken past finally catching up to him, whether it's Veroska, Barbie Wire, or Fizzarolli, and I'm totally down for it every single time. And this one works the best for me because of how much foreshadowing there was prior to the episode, which makes it feel more grounded and meaningful, and you can definitely tell this is something VisiPop carefully planned from the very start. And now it's time to get back to Lululand, because this is probably the most ingenious foreshadowing plot element in the entire show, and it fits so nicely in line with the flashback scene despite being released almost 3 years ago. Before this episode came out, I always thought that Robo-Fizz and the whole sequence of Lululand burning down was just such a random choice. Like, why have a robot version of Fizz when you could have just had the real Fizz? What does burning down the entire place accomplish? Why is Robo-Fizz still functional as his exoskeleton is just being slowly melted away by the flames? Like, I just don't understand what made the writers want to specifically include any of this at all, and I assumed it was just all for cheap laughs and random design choices. But now, I finally understand why everything had to be that way, because the entire sequence of Lululand burning down is an exact recreation of the All-Imp circus being destroyed by the fire. Blitz's conflict with Fizzarolli leads to Blitz accidentally knocking over someone carrying flames, which causes the entire place to erupt into chaos, and it does the exact same damage to Robo-Fizz as it does to the real one, slowly melting off all of his clothes and his skin, and then the whole thing ends with one giant explosion, just completely annihilating the place. Except, there's one key difference between the two versions that completely recontextualizes everything. Blitz has grown as a character. In Lululand, there is absolutely zero emotional investment with the fire, because it correlates with how Blitz feels about his past at the time. The fire in Lululand is played off insignificantly because it's a representation of how Blitz used to deal with his trauma, by trying to shut it out and pretend like it was nothing of importance, similar to Veroska. Blitz doesn't want to have any feelings about Fizzarolli or Veroska or Stolas because it's too painful for him to come to terms with losing them after building up a relationship. And instead he only wants to push them away before it happens again. But in this episode, we finally get to see what happened in the fire, and it's at this exact moment when Blitz is forced to relive his trauma face to face. In response, Blitz says 3 words: I did care. It's at this exact moment where he comes to the realization of his wrongs and finally decides to open up again and make amends with Fizz. And then if it wasn't already genius enough, the climax of the episode then reenacts the fire for the 3rd time, putting Blitz and Fizzarolli in the exact same position as before. But after opening up to Fizz and coming to terms with his actions, Blitz finally decides to save him, and I love the neat touches of Blitz utilizing his circus acrobatics to save Fizzarolli, showing that he has fully embraced his past and isn't trying to run away from it anymore. You know, it's like poetry, it rhymes. And I can tell this is the scene that's going to set off a chain reaction further down the season as Blitz makes amends with the rest of the characters. And considering Season 2 Episode 9 is called Apology Tour, I'm hoping that'll be the case. Also, I do want to take a moment to apologize for a criticism I made in my Unhappy Campers video relating to Barbie Wire. In that video, I complained about how the episode barely even touched on Blitz and Barbie's past at all, instead just establishing that Barbie hated him and that Blitz quote-unquote ruined everything and did something very bad. And I was really disappointed because it was such a shallow introduction for Barbie. But now I fully understand why VivziePop didn't include it in episode 5, because their past is directly tied to the same fire. It's what led to Blitz's mother dying. It not only explained why Blitz was too overwhelmed to think properly and save Fizzarolli, but it fills the gaps of two backstories at the same time. Like, that is just genius writing. And the reason they didn't mention Barbie's past at all in episode 5 was because it would then spoil Fizzarolli's backstory. So I'm actually glad that it was glossed over in Unhappy Campers so that it could be saved for this episode. Now, that whole thing was my favorite aspect of the episode. I am so glad they didn't hold back with these two characters, and it really feels like a long time since Blitz got proper character development, and it's been a while since he was actually the main character of the show. I never really cared about Fizzarolli up until watching this episode, and I just never expected him to be so much more fleshed out than he was in Season 1, Episode 7. And my god, those flashback scenes, now that is what people mean when they say show don't tell. But there's still a multitude of things in this episode I want to talk about, like a bunch of other characters in the episode, as well as the pacing. Admittedly, the pacing in this episode is borderline rapid. It's not because the episode is a result of 3 separate plot lines being awkwardly shoved together like Unhappy Campers, but just because a lot happens in this one single plot line of Crimson and Stryker kidnapping Blitz and Fizzarolli. I personally think that the faster pacing is fine for this episode. It doesn't make the plot hard to follow, and in fact it makes the episode more fun and energetic. But something I do want to point out that's related to this is that despite how amazing the backstory moments are, there still isn't enough time to soak in all the emotional moments between Blitz and Fizzarolli. The episode keeps switching back and forth between them coming to terms with their past and then fighting off Crimson's henchmen, and it really does feel kind of jarring. And it's not helped with the fact that in between all of those back and forth switches, it gets interrupted by a scene with Stolas and Osmodeus, and it brings the rapid tension of the fight scenes to a grinding halt. I want to say that the tonal whiplash undermines the significance of the emotional moments with Blitz and Fizzarolli, and it's completely understandable as to why they weren't given enough time since the episode was already at 25 minutes. Speaking of undermining emotional moments, the jokes in this episode are really not that bad, actually. A big problem with the jokes in Western Energy and Unhappy Campers was that they became overly reliant on swearing for their jokes, with no punchline except the swearing itself. And that really came at the expense of Blitz's character, since his dialogue was just getting reduced to these kind of jokes more and more frequently to the point where you start to wonder if they're even trying to be funny. This episode still has a bunch of swearing and sex jokes, as every Helluva Boss episode does, but it's not as excessive as the last two, and they really don't make Blitz's dialogue feel two-dimensional like it did before. And this episode has a lot of other jokes which I found absolutely hilarious. I already mentioned Stryker's facial expression, but also the entire sequences of Blitz and Fizz escaping the cage, along with Fizzarolli's song, were just so ridiculously absurd that I loved watching them. And I feel like an absolute degenerate when I say that the solid 30 seconds of Fizzarolli cycling through every single possible facial expression talking about Ozzie's big cock just got me dying laughing. Now it's time to address the elephant in the room, the villains. In this episode, they brought back not one, but 2 big antagonists, Stryker and Crimson, only after 2 episodes, which is really surprising. I'm gonna be totally honest here. The villains are a complete joke. They have an initial menacing presence at the beginning of the episode, but as the plot goes on and Blitz and Fizzarolli work their way to escaping the warehouse, the episode does not take them seriously at all. For the most part, both Stryker and Crimson are just punching bags, and they're not as much of a threat as they were in Harvest Moon Festival or X's and O's, and they're mostly just played off for laughs. Now, does that mean that the villains are necessarily bad? No, actually, and that's a topic I'm going to dive into for another video. In the episodes following the events of Ozzie's, the show has been very vague about Blitz's feelings towards Stolas. Even with them interacting and seeing stars and Western energy, there is never a clear picture of their feelings towards each other, or even whether or not the events at Ozzie seem to affect them at all. But in this episode, we finally got a direct perspective of how Blitz feels. Blitz takes all of these signs of genuine affection from Stolas and twists them to sound like Stolas is just manipulating him. But I love how Fizzarolli can immediately tell that Blitz is just lying to himself to avoid seeming vulnerable, since Fizz and Ozzie are also in an unconventional relationship and they completely understand what it's like. But now we need to talk about Stolas. I consider this to be in the nitpick category of criticism since it doesn't affect anything else in the episode, but my biggest issue with the episode was Stolas. He doesn't really do much. The episode did follow up on his appointment with Osmodeus, which was teased at the start of Western Energy, and we did get the confirmation that Stolas wanted to give Blitz an Osmodean crystal, which would then be the final test of whether or not Blitz decides to stay with Stolas. And by the way, I'm really intrigued by that. But other than that, Stolas spends majority of the episode just being a quirky comic relief side character to Osmodeus. His constant lighthearted tone doesn't really fit the scene considering that the life of Ozzie's closest partner Fizz is literally on the line. They didn't mess up his character or anything, he just didn't really serve a purpose beyond his meeting with Osmodeus. I've already done an in-depth look on Blitz and Fizz's relations to each other, so to end the video on a real high note, let's talk about Fizzarolli and Osmodeus. For a show about horny demons and assassinating people for money, Helluva Boss, whether it be Moxie and Millie, Bee and Vortex, or Fizz and Osmodeus, has some of the most wholesome relationships I've seen in animation. Fizz and Ozzie are absolutely adorable. They're just all over each other and their back and forth dialogue feels so natural and it makes their relationship actually believable. It's such a strong contrast to how they acted in public when they appeared in season 1 episode 7. And like, I'm not even gay, but these two are just such a perfect couple. And James Monroe Iglehart does a fantastic job at making Ozzie sound so sweet and soft-spoken. And I can't wait to hear more of them in the future. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case. Season 2, Episode 6, Oops, is a Helluva Boss masterpiece. It feels so much more vibrant and complex and alive than all the other Season 2 episodes I've seen so far. There's so many things to unpack after rewatching it again and again, and I have rewatched this episode maybe 5 or 6 times by now in full. And the reason I didn't go all out in my Unhappy Campers review like I did here in this one is because there really wasn't much at all. After Episode 6 released, I went to go watch the leaked unfinished version of the episode, and it was completely devoid of any background audio and sound effects, and you can only see the rough outlines of all the animations. It just makes me all the more glad that I didn't watch it before the official release, because this episode just isn't the same without everything else. And if you were one of the people who couldn't resist the urge and decided to watch the leaked version first, my heart bleeds for you, but at the same time,
I simply don't give a fuck.
You know, I have no idea why this episode is so much better than all the other ones. Maybe Viv was always packing for this one single episode and then had to write a bunch of mediocre ones along the way. Or maybe she just happened to pop off when she wrote this one. Or maybe she just quietly shoved Adam Nayland out of the writing room. But this episode is just better than all the other Season 2 episodes in every single respect. I'm not sure if this is my favorite Helluva Boss episode of all time, but it comes very close. And I haven't had this much fun watching Helluva Boss in a while. Well, in a way, that is the end of the video. There's so many more things I want to talk about, and I will in the future. And I'm gonna be honest, majority of the time since the episode release, I've just spent cutting this video script in half because it was becoming way too unfocused and overstuffed. And I mean, it still turned out to be kind of a mess, but there is just so much I love about this episode and the show as a whole, and I can never get enough of it when I write these scripts. Hats off to VizzyPop and all the people who worked on this episode, and I really can't wait to see what Spin-a-Horse has in store for us in the future episodes to come.
Also, I want a Luna episode.
Okay, well this video is 18 minutes long. I have lost many hours of sleep making this video, and this is probably the first time I've actually fallen asleep on my desk. So if you like what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing, because it would really mean a lot. Anyway, that's all I got for today. I'll see you all in the next video.